Figure skating sells an image of control, a body moving through the air with total command, landing on a blade the width of a finger, holding still on one leg like the wind doesn't exist. Every jump, every spin, every lift looks like proof that a human being can master gravity, if they train hard enough, if they're disciplined enough. That control only exists inside the rink. Outside of it, on a plane headed to a connecting flight, in a heart nobody thought to screen. At the edge of a window in a foreign city, control means nothing. The ice can be perfect, and the skater flawless, and none of it matters when something outside their control decides otherwise. Here are 5 of the deadliest figure skating moments that nobody saw coming. It's February 15th, 1961, and a Sabena Boeing 707 is on approach to Brussels Airport, carrying the entire United States figure skating team toward a connecting flight to Prague, Czechoslovakia, and the 1961 World Figure Skating Championships. 2 weeks earlier, at the U.S. Championships in Colorado Springs, the team had crowned its new stars. Lawrence Owen had just won the ladies' title, a 16-year-old already being talked about as the future of the sport. 2 days before takeoff, she had appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated, photographed in a bright red dress with her signature short haircut, under a line calling her America's most exciting girl skater. Her older sister, Maribel Owen, had won the pairs title alongside her partner, Dudley Richards. Their mother, Maribel Vinson Owen, a 9-time national champion and Olympic bronze medalist herself, was traveling as a coach. At Idlewild Airport in New York, the team posed for photographs on the steps of the aircraft. 18 skaters, 6 coaches, judges, officials, and family, all in good spirits, all unaware that the cameras capturing them boarding were capturing the last images the public would ever see of them alive. The transatlantic leg was routine. Skies over Brussels were clear that morning. But on final approach, with the smaller aircraft still clearing the runway, the pilots aborted the landing and circled back for another attempt. That second approach was aborted too. Witnesses on the ground watched the plane bank harder and harder, climbing to over 1,000 feet in what looked like pilots fighting the aircraft rather than flying it. The bank angle kept increasing until the plane was nearly vertical. Then it leveled its wings, pitched up sharply, lost speed, and spiraled down into farmland near the village of Berg, just outside Kampenhout. All 72 people aboard were killed. A farmer working his field below was also struck by debris and died, bringing the toll to 73. It remains to this day the deadliest crash in Belgian aviation history. When rescue workers moved through the wreckage, one of the things they recovered was a signed copy of that Sports Illustrated issue. Lawrence Owen, still smiling on the cover. What caused it has never been fully settled. Investigators from Belgium, the United States, and international aviation bodies spent months on the wreckage and came away without a definitive answer. The leading theory pointed to a failure in the mechanism that controlled the tail stabilizer, something that could explain the pilot's apparent inability to stop the aircraft's nose from pitching up. Other analysts leaned toward pilot error compounding a mechanical problem that was recoverable if handled differently. No side of that argument was ever proven beyond doubt, and the case remains officially inconclusive. The impact on the sport was immediate. Within a day, the International Skating Union polled its members and voted to cancel the 1961 World Championships outright, the only time in the event's history it has been called off for a reason other than war. President John F. Kennedy, barely a month into office, issued a personal statement of condolence, noting the country had lost talent and grace that had brought pleasure to people all over the world. He had a personal connection, too. Pairs skater Dudley Richards had been a friend of his from summers spent in Hyannisport. In the aftermath, U.S. figure skating issued a mandate that still stands today. No national team travels to an international competition on the same aircraft. It was a rule written directly out of grief, and it has never needed to be tested twice. The organization also established a memorial fund in the victims' names, one that has quietly helped pay for the training of American skaters ever since, so that a program built by the dead could keep producing the living. But the crash left behind wasn't just heartbreak, it was a vacuum. Coaches, officials, and an entire generation of champions had been wiped out in a single morning, and the program that had dominated the sport through the 1950s suddenly had almost nobody left to teach the next wave. Foreign-born coaches came to fill roles once held by Americans killed in the crash. It would take years before the United States won another world medal, and the better part of a decade before it reached the top of the sport again. One of the names that filled that void, an Italian coach who crossed the Atlantic in the years after Berg, is a name this list will come back to before it's finished. It's November 20th, 1995, and inside a rink in Lake Placid, New York, Sergey Grinkov and Ekaterina A are running through a routine training session, preparing for the next stop on the Stars on Ice tour. Nothing about the afternoon suggested it would be the last time the two of them skated together. Grinkov had been born in Moscow in 1967 and came up through the Soviet sports system, and by 1995 he was already one of the most decorated pairs skaters in the world. He and Gordieva had won Olympic gold twice, first at the 1988 Calgary Winter Olympics, then again at the 1994 Lillehammer Winter Olympics, after taking advantage of a rule change that let professional skaters reclaim their amateur status. Between those two Olympic titles sat 4 world championships. The two had skated together since they were children, Gordieva just 11 years old when they were paired, Grinkov 15. They married in 1991 and had a daughter, Daria, the following year. On the ice, they were known for a kind of quiet that other skaters couldn't replicate, blades that seemed to whisper rather than cut. During that training run in Lake Placid, they were setting up for a lift, one they had done together thousands of times. Grinkov let go and dropped to the ice. At first it looked like nothing, the kind of stumble any skater takes over a career. Gordieva was on the ice with him when it happened, and by her own account her first thought was that he had simply lost his footing. Then he didn't get up. The confusion in the rink shifted fast, from mild concern to something closer to panic, as it became clear this wasn't a fall anyone could shake off. Emergency responders arrived and worked to revive him. He was pronounced dead a short time later at a nearby hospital. He was 28 years old. The autopsy gave an answer nobody in the arena that day could have guessed at. Grinkov had died of a massive heart attack, and the cause underneath it was severe atherosclerosis, a buildup of plaque inside his coronary arteries, so advanced that one of the main vessels had narrowed to an opening described as the size of a pinhole. His heart was enlarged, consistent with high blood pressure that had gone unmanaged, and examiners found evidence that he had suffered a smaller heart attack within a day of the one that killed him. Later, study of his case identified a genetic marker linked to premature heart attacks, a variant that researchers came to informally call the Grinkov risk factor. There had been no diagnosis before that day, no chest pain reported publicly, no flagged test, no warning that Gordieva or anyone close to him had been given. He trained daily. He competed at the highest level the sport had, and underneath all of that conditioning, his arteries had been closing for years without anyone knowing to look. The skating world reacted with the kind of shock that comes from watching someone at the peak of physical performance die from something invisible. Grinkov hadn't looked sick. He hadn't skated like a man with a failing heart. That contradiction, a body trained to Olympic standard carrying a condition usually associated with age and neglect, became part of what made his death so unsettling to the people who knew him and the sport he'd shaped. Gordieva didn't leave the sport. In February 1996, she skated a solo tribute to him titled A Celebration of a Life, performed in Hartford, Connecticut, and broadcast to a national audience, one of the most watched moments in figure skating television history. She later wrote a memoir, My Sergey, and continued to perform and tour for years afterward, carrying his name into rinks he would never see again. What stayed with the sport wasn't the fall itself. It was the fact that his heart had been failing for what doctors believed was years, hidden entirely behind a body that had spent a lifetime proving it could do almost anything asked of it. On July 18, 2020, word starts moving through the figure skating world out of Moscow. Ekaterina Alexandrovskaya is dead. She's 20 years old. She'd been born in Russia on the first day of the year 2000 and trained inside the Russian skating system as a young girl, the kind of pipeline that produces some of the most technically precise pairs skaters on Earth. But she made a choice that set her apart from most of her peers. She left to compete for Australia, the home country of her skating partner, Harley Windsor. Windsor, of indigenous Australian heritage, had trained in Russia himself, and the two built a partnership that carried Australia into territory the country's figure skating program had rarely touched at that level. In 2017, Alexandrovskaya and Windsor won the World Junior Figure Skating Championship. It wasn't just a personal milestone, it made them the first Australian pair to win gold at that level, and it put both of their names on a short list of skaters expected to carry the country's hopes into future Olympic cycles. She was 17 when she took that title. The following year, the two of them competed at the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, with the Windsor becoming the first Indigenous Australian to compete at a Winter Games. She was a skater who, on paper, had years of high-level competition still ahead of her. Instead, in early 2020, she stepped away from the sport. The reasons were health-related. She had been diagnosed with epilepsy after a seizure, a condition that made the physical and mental demands of elite pairs skating difficult, if not impossible, to sustain safely. Those close to her later said she had also been struggling with depression. For an athlete who had just broken new ground for her adopted country, the retirement closed a door that had looked, only a couple of years earlier, wide open. What came after is where the story asks to be handled gently. On July 18, 2020, Alexandrovskaya fell from the window of a sixth-floor apartment in Moscow. Russian law enforcement, cited by the state news agency, treated the death as an apparent suicide. A short note was reportedly found, a single word in Russian that translates to "I love." Her mother was hospitalized from shock after her daughter's body was found. Beyond those few documented facts, the public record stays thin, and there is little to be gained from speculating past it. The skating world responded with the kind of grief reserved for talent cut short before its ceiling was ever tested. Windsor posted a tribute online, remembering her as a bright light and struggling openly with the news. The Australian Olympic Committee and the International Skating Union both issued statements of condolence. None of it changed the basic shape of what had happened. A champion who had broken ground for her sport at 17 was, at 20, no longer competing, no longer training, and then simply gone. The distance between those 2 points, a World Junior title in 2017 and a death in Moscow in 2020, is where her story sits. What's documented is the win, the Olympic appearance, the retirement citing illness, and then the end. A young woman carrying more than the people cheering her ever saw. If her story leaves anything behind, it is a reminder that the pressures inside elite sport do not stop at the boards, and that they are often invisible right up until they aren't. On January 29, 2025, American Airlines Flight 542 is on final approach to Reagan National Airport outside Washington, D.C., finishing a route that started in Wichita, Kansas. It's a short domestic hop, the kind of flight most of the people on board had probably taken without thinking twice. Near the Potomac River, at around 300 feet, the regional jet collides midair with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter running a training flight. Both aircraft go down into the river within seconds of impact. There's no gradual unraveling here, no minutes of struggle like Brussels in 1961. Just a collision, and then 2 wrecks in the water. All 67 people aboard both aircraft are killed. 60 passengers and 4 crew on the jet, 3 soldiers on the helicopter. Nobody survives. It becomes the deadliest air disaster on U.S. soil in more than 2 decades, and for days it dominates every news cycle in the country. Then, the passenger list starts to circulate, and the story narrows into something the skating world recognizes immediately. 28 of the people on that jet are connected to figure skating, athletes, coaches, and family. Most of them flying home from a U.S. figure skating development camp held in Wichita after the national championships. 11 of them are skaters, all between the ages of 11 and 16. Kids who'd just spent days training with coaches trying to identify the next wave of national talent. The national championships had wrapped in Wichita only days before, and the camp had gathered promising young skaters from clubs across the country, which is why so many of the sports families happened to be routed through the same city, onto the same flights home, at the same time. Among the dead are two sisters from the Washington Figure Skating Club, Everly Livingston, 14, and Lydia Livingston, 11. They'd built a small following posting their routines online, and their parents, Donna and Peter Livingston, were flying home with them. All four are gone. Franco Aparicio, 14, who skated at the same club, dies alongside his father, who had traveled out with him. Their coach, Inna Volyanskaya, a 59-year-old former Soviet skater who had spent years teaching young athletes in the D.C. area, is on the flight too. And in another part of the cabin sit two names the sport knew long before that night: Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov, a married pair who had won the World Championship for Russia in 1994 in Chiba, Japan, then moved to the United States in the late 1990s and built a second life as coaches, first in Simsbury, Connecticut, and most recently at the Skating Club of Boston. They had flown to Wichita to watch their students compete. They were going home with them. The investigation into the collision takes more than a year. The National Transportation Safety Board eventually points to the placement of a helicopter route running dangerously close to the runway approach path, a corridor that at one point left as little as 75 feet of vertical separation between a helicopter and a landing airliner, along with gaps in Federal Aviation Administration oversight and errors made by the helicopter crew in the final seconds before the crash. None of that is settled in the days right after, and families are still identifying bodies, and the skating world is still counting who it has lost. What's known now is the shape of the failure, a route that should never have crossed that close to a runway, a system that leaned too heavily on pilots simply seeing each other in time, and a helicopter crew that didn't. People inside the sport make the same comparison almost immediately, and they don't need prompting to make it. 64 years earlier, almost to the month, Sabena Flight 548 had wiped out the entire U.S. figure skating team on its way to a competition overseas. Now, the sport is losing another group tied to its future, though not in the same way. In 1961, the crash took the reigning champions themselves, the skaters who had already won. In 2025, it takes a mix. Coaches who had once stood on world podiums, parents who had driven to 1,000 early practices, and children being groomed for a stage still years away. Most of the young skaters were too new to have a real shot at the 2026 Winter Olympics. They'd been flown to Wichita because someone believed they might be ready by 2030, or the games after that. U.S. figure skating calls it the most devastating loss the sport has faced since 1961. It's not a comparison anyone in the sport needed explained to them. It's March 20th, 1997, at the World Figure Skating Championships in Lausanne, Switzerland, and one of the most important coaches in the sport's history is sitting ringside where he has sat for decades. His name is Carlo Fassi, and to understand why his death belongs on this list, you have to go back to the very first story on it. After Sabena Flight 548 destroyed the American program in 1961, the United States needed teachers it no longer had. Fassi, an Italian former champion, was one of the coaches who answered that vacuum. He moved to the United States, settled at the famous Broadmoor rink in Colorado Springs, became an American citizen, and over the next 2 decades built one of the most successful coaching records the sport has ever seen. He guided Peggy Fleming to Olympic gold in 1968 and Dorothy Hamill to gold in 1976, 2 of the defining champions of American skating. He coached the British men John Curry and Robin Cousins to their own Olympic titles, guided later champions like Jill Trenery, and shaped a long line of national and world medalists in between. For years, the road to an Olympic figure skating medal seemed to run straight through his rink in Colorado. The program that the 1961 crash had gutted was, in no small part, rebuilt by men like him. By 1997, he was 67 years old and still working in Lausanne as the coach of American champion Nicole Bobek, a skater who thought of him as a father figure. That morning, he complained of indigestion and dizziness. It didn't read at first as anything serious. He was taken from the arena to a hospital in the city, and by early that afternoon he was gone, killed by a heart attack in the middle of the event that had been the backdrop of his entire life. Like Sergey Grinkov 2 years before him, he was a man whose heart gave out with almost no warning, except this time it happened not to a 28-year-old athlete, but to the aging teacher who had helped resurrect a sport after its darkest day. There is a strange symmetry to it. Fassi came to America because a plane crash in 1961 emptied the sport of its teachers, and he spent his life refilling that space, championship by championship. He died at the World Championships, the same kind of event that the 1961 team had been flying toward when it went down. The sport he helped save was, in the end, the last thing he saw. His students carried on. Nicole Bobeck finished her competition in Lausanne days after his death, skating for the man who was no longer there to meet her at the boards. The tributes came from every corner of the skating world, because there was hardly a top rink on 2 continents that his work hadn't touched. What made his death land so hard wasn't shock at the impossible. It was the quiet fact that a man who had spent 36 years putting the sport back together was simply, suddenly, not there to keep doing it. None of it showed on the ice. Not the plaque narrowing a heart for years, not a fault line in a tail stabilizer, not a helicopter route drawn too close to a runway, not whatever weight finally became too much for a 20-year-old in Moscow to carry alone. A blade, a plane, a heart, a window, each one invisible until the moment it wasn't, and by then, the music had already started.